Welcome back, Estelden here. Resident Evil 3! It isn't too far away, and I'll be honest, I'm pretty excited. I mean, you go back even 5 years ago, and if someone told me there was a new Resident Evil coming out, I wouldn't have given a toss. Capcom have done a pretty good job turning the horror series back on its head, and I mean, yeah, they're gonna run out of remakes pretty soon, but they might as well ride this little gravy train all the way to Code Veronica. Resident Evil 2 is obviously what's gotten me most excited for the series, and I'd say it's beyond that. It's the sort of game that can rejuvenate horror as a whole genre, and even AI in general. Mr. X, and I'll go into more detail on him later, but he is seriously impressive, and the thing I loved so much was his introduction. In almost every modern game, a reveal like Mr. X would involve some sort of drawn-out cutscene. Control stripped from the player while we watch him snarl at us before finally being given control back. All the tension's gone as we know we've reached a checkpoint of some sort. Instead, it was brilliantly handled organically through gameplay. We all remember the scene and that immediate terror when Mr. X comes around that darkened corner and that helicopter goes flying. You just can't capture that in a cutscene, and developers need to learn from it. What makes me most excited for Resi 3 is what they can learn from the best area of Resi 2, the police station. Both the original and the remake are at their best at this part of the game. The level design is incredible, in the remake especially, and it was a step up from Resi 7 with the puzzle design and exploration being a little bit more interesting. On the topic of Resi 7, it has some good moments, the intro was fantastic, the whole section from entering the house in daylight to meeting the Bakers and exploring the estate. In that moment, I felt Capcom had finally learned from their mistakes, although then they sort of started to repeat them again because there were some tedious boss battles and a real strange focus on action towards the very end. The police station, though, is exactly what Resi 3 needs to learn from, capturing the tight level design, the shortcuts, the puzzles, everything fitted together really neatly like a jigsaw puzzle. It's environments like these which really prove Resident Evil is back, that horror is back. Obviously, nailing that sort of environment in the city streets that Resi 3 is forced to work with might seem a little bit more difficult, but it doesn't need to be that way. The streets might have been in the original, but really the only difference needs to be on what the art team might come up with. The team behind the design don't need to create open, enemy-filled streets, they can mix it up, and they can still make specific sections feel just like the police station and give a sense of progression and accomplishment as the player moves forward. The series' new direction is something I hope has a big influence on horror overall. We've had snippets of intriguing games with Amnesia, although that was like a decade ago now, Jesus Christ. And then of course you've got Outlast. Outlast might have had some jump scares and some interesting story elements, but the gameplay is pretty boring to a degree. The way I look at a game sometimes is I imagine how it would hold up if you replaced everything with Final Fantasy VII style character models, and they were the graphics for the entire game. If it doesn't hold up to that scrutiny, then the gameplay really isn't that good and it was simply other elements making you play it. Outlast falls into that category as it's just a matter of running around in an interesting setting, occasionally hiding when the devs are feeling creative. Resi 2 Remake most certainly holds up to that scrutiny. Mr. X isn't scary simply because of his new character model. The sound design is brilliant, and since at least on reasonable difficulties, there's that loss of progress if you allow him to catch you and throw you into the game over screen. It just keeps the tension high. Horror games are at their very best when there's a fear of failing. Knowing you'll lose progress, as feeling like you've lost time is the ultimate thing we fear. I mean, just think about all of us who work 9 to 5 and then reflect on the time we're wasting. I mean, yeah, that's horror. Anyway, I think back to Dead Space, and while it's a great game, it's the perfect example of how not to do this. There were manual saves in that game which really gave me hope. But then there's these checkpoints as well, meaning even if you die, you actually don't lose any progress. It's like the developers are scared that if you lose anything, you'll put the game down and won't try the sequel. I have no doubt little conveniences like that were EA meddling with their graphs and metrics, but thank God Capcom have been humbled by their previous failing and just went back to what worked for them years ago. When we look back on gaming history, Resident Evil 4, it really stands out to me. I'd love to be edgy, I'd love to poke the bear and say that this game sucks, but yeah, look, it doesn't. It's a great game on its own. However, its legacy and influence are not. It spawned the likes of Resident Evil 5 and made every game publisher out there question whatever obscure genre they were already working on, and started looking for how they can turn it into an action series. I think if Resident Evil 4 had have sold moderately well instead of just being a huge juggernaut, it probably would have been a one-off. but its critical success saw Capcom chase a non-existent cash cow to the ends of the earth, ultimately falling off the deep end and pretty much ending back where they started, making horror games that will sell well with a particular audience. I believe now that the dust has settled on that get-rich-quick fiasco of the last decade or so, we're seeing niche games becoming a part of the gaming landscape again, from indies up to AAA. Resident Evil 2 Remake might have sold well, but it's not going to be for everyone, and horror titles are never going to reach the same level of success as titles like Red Dead Redemption or Call of Duty. But Capcom no longer care. They know they can focus on being the very best at one of these subgenres. Whether it be Monster Hunter, Devil May Cry 5, those games don't have much in the way of serious competition in their genre, which means anyone and everyone who is a remote fan of these types of games are going to buy them. It's something that is working for Capcom, and if the rest of the industry did the same thing instead of putting out these half-baked live service titles, trying to turn specific series into something they're not, then maybe companies would start to build loyal followings again, instead of being mocked all over the internet and basically being treated like the general public treat politicians nowadays. The perfect example of that type of nonsense is Ghost Recon Breakpoint. Because it flopped so hard and Ubisoft's laziness is no longer being rewarded, it will make other companies like EA and Activision wary of doing similar, and that in itself will do a lot for the landscape. Back to Resident Evil 3, there's something important I believe it can learn from too. Keep in mind that I doubt this is going to be fixed, but having options to remove it and ensuring that the game is designed around that removal is something that I feel is really important. What I'm talking about are the icons that flash up when you interact with things. I think horror games are very easy to get wrong. What I'm talking about here is how whenever you come up to things you can interact with, little icons pop up to tell you. It might sound minor, but when you're completely immersed in a horror game, you've got the lights off, your headphones are on, you've got the Nightmare of Elm Street remake on in the background for good measure. No, not really. I mean, I would really hope not anyway. But you're completely taken in by the world. There is nothing more gamey, nothing more condescending than having these arrows pop up on things you can click on. For one, it kills any sense of looking around and exploring, since it becomes like a mini-map in RPGs. It becomes follow the arrow. That tension is completely gone because you're not worried about searching places thoroughly, being engrossed in the setting and the room or dark alley you're in, because the game is basically telling you you've already clicked on all the things that you need to. Now, I will mention that the case is not so bad in Remake 2 as it is with some other games, including Resident Evil 7. But it's an example of a game being excellent in so many departments and just missing the mark when it comes to something that could make it the ultimate horror game. There's other problems you run into after the police station, also with a lot more cutscenes, with things feeling a little bit more streamlined. Resident Evil needs to accept it's at its very best when it gives you large locations to explore that you slowly unlock through puzzle solving and resource management. Looking at the gameplay footage we've seen, Resident Evil does feel a little bit cheaper and has less of the polish than last year's edition. I don't have a huge problem with it. If the gameplay is just as fun and Nemesis can be as good as Mr. X with a few other extras thrown in, then yeah, I'm happy enough with that. Mr. X is so enjoyable that even just expansions to 2 that throw a new cast of characters into another mansion, a fire station, or whatever you want, it would be something I'd buy without hesitation. Mr. X's AI design is just such a joy that it really turns the attention to other AAA titles and why this sort of quality isn't found in other areas. The same can also be said for the Alien in Isolation, which is kind of where you feel all of this started. It was at least a very big influence. What does give me hope is this engine Capcom are using is clearly very easy to work with, and I don't see any reason why Resident Evil 8 or a future spin-off can't keep using it. It works, and while there's no guarantee Resi 3 will actually be really good, I think it's a safe bet that if it just does a bit more of the same of 2, it's going to be worth buying. That said, there's some areas that do look blatantly reused, like the sewers, and I do have a feeling a lot of the streets we explored in the Resi 2 DLCs are likely going to be reskinned or whatever you want to call it for Resi 3. I'm going to be very interested to see just how far they go with the remake as well. And that's because the game does expand later down the line with a clock tower in the original that you get to explore. Seeing as the gameplay footage that's been doing the round seems to all be the streets, I do hope that the fun of that area and the areas beyond it aren't watered down with everything going into the city streets when it comes to the devs' efforts. The variety of the game is what makes it so great, so I do hope they're just saving it and that it's not missing or anything like that. Nemesis is where things get tricky. It's obviously a reskin Mr. X with some new abilities, and that's totally fine. The excellence of Mr. X is worth reusing, and look, I did want more, but I worry that with what I've seen, that Nemesis is being overused. The reason Mr. X was so great in 2 is he's not in the entire game. He saved the big moments, and the fact that the open area side of Mr. X is all saved for the police station makes it a pleasure to replay and makes his appearances feel more hand-placed overall. My worry is Capcom saw how great the feedback from Mr. X was and decided to double down on having Nemesis all over the game, to the point of just making him feel like a nuisance instead of being genuinely scary. I'm aware that in the original, Nemesis is far more prominent than his counterpart in 2, but that doesn't mean this new version is going to be suitable in the same way. I'm not sure it's necessary to include features one-to-one, such as killing Nemesis every so often for item upgrades. This is a brand new game and a new era of horror, and I'd rather they simply expand on the moments that made Remake's Mr. X so good. Once the dust settles on Resi 3, it will be interesting to see where the series and horror in general go. Resi 8 is no doubt in development, and the jury is out on whether it will look to expand on the first-person innovation of 7, or look to its third-person roots with a twist on what we've gotten with the recent remakes. I'm torn because the gameplay of the remakes appears to be even better than what we got in 7, but I still think 8 needs to offer something really unique and different for it to stand on its own 2 feet, and not just look like another expansion of those recent titles. Look, as long as it doesn't go action again and it looks to move the horror medium forward, then I can't believe I'm saying this after all this time, but I actually trust Capcom. Perhaps in some sort of bizarro world, I'd actually feel that same way about Konami, and we'd be looking forward to Silent Hills releasing this year as well. It feels very odd that in 2020, one of my most anticipated games is a Resident Evil title. If I'd known I'd feel this way back in the 2000s, it would be interesting thinking about whether it's because gaming is in such a bad place now, or because Resident Evil is so good. Maybe it's a bit of both. Anyway, I do hope if they go down the DLC route again, they actually give us some stories this time, rather than just mini-games, and seriously, I will lose it if Capcom tries to charge us for that original soundtrack option once again. We've got about a month to go before all of this will be revealed, and we'll finally hear stars. Thanks again, guys, and I'll see you again.